I froze as my spigot ran dry at midnight. The HOA had cut it off without warning. Little did she know the reservoir she relied on bore my name on the deed. Let me take you back. At midnight, my water spigot ran dry. Karen had cut it off. My farm, my livelihood threatened in silence. I stepped out of the house, the warm summer air sticking to my skin, crickets chirping lazily in the tall grass. The moon barely lit the edges of the corral, but the barn loomed like a shadowed sentinel. My boots crunched against the gravel as I made my way to the spigot heart, thumping in a rhythm I hadn't felt since my first drought scare. The tap, my trusty spigot that had served generations, now offered nothing but a hollow gurgle. A faint smell of wet grass drifted from the reservoir, tangy and slightly sour. It hit me oddly, why now? Something about the HOA notice taped to the gate didn't sit right. The paper was certified sure, but the ink smudged slightly as if handled hastily. My fingers brushed it, leaving a faint imprint. Small-town politics were usually just whispers, but tonight the whispers had teeth. I glanced around. A neighbor's silhouette moved past, voice low, almost conspiratorial. Karen's been extra strict lately, they murmured, eyes darting toward the barn. I felt a tug of irritation and disbelief. Water rights were supposed to be straightforward. My family had tended this land for decades, and yet here I was standing under the pale glow of a flickering bulb spigot, dry, and the faint stench of wet grass reminding me that someone was crossing lines that weren't theirs. Inside the barn, the shadows stretched across the worn wood and hay bales. Each corner seemed exaggerated, a ghostly witness to Karen's audacity. I flicked the light switch again, nothing. Just the gurgle echoing in the darkness. I crouched to inspect the tap, running my fingers along its cold metal. The prop that had never failed me now symbolized the start of a standoff I hadn't asked for. I held the certified HOA letter in my hands. The paper felt almost fragile, crinkling slightly where my thumb pressed. Ink smudged from a careless stamp, a minor imperfection that somehow made Karen's threat feel more tangible, more personal. My mind raced through possibilities: legal avenues, water rights, documentation, county records. But the first step was obvious: I needed clarity. Yet there was that itch, the instinct that came from years of managing crises quietly. The quiet hero in me, the one who dealt with problems before they became public spectacles, stirred awake. I stepped back, taking in the fence line, the neighboring houses faint in the distance. The town was asleep, or so it seemed. My gaze fell again on the letter. It referenced a violation of the HOA covenant, but the phrasing was so broad it felt intentionally vague. Did Karen think she could intimidate me overnight, cut off access to my own resources, and claim compliance? My stomach twisted with a mix of anger and disbelief. Every small sound seemed amplified: the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of an irrigation pump, a loose shutter banging softly in the wind. My hand hovered over my phone. Confront Karen now, or dig through the legal documentation first. Each choice felt heavy, weighted with the knowledge that any misstep could escalate unnecessarily. I breathed in the night air, thick with the smell of damp earth and cut grass. The tension coiled tight, yet the clarity of purpose began to form. I wasn't just a rancher tonight. I was a quiet guardian of what was mine. I pocketed the letter, feeling the weight of history and responsibility in that simple act. Steps carried me back toward the house, but my mind traced the layout of the property, the reservoir, the barn, each in stark relief against the moonlight. Decisions had to be made, strategies considered. Yet, for all the chaos, Karen's act promised a calm resolve took root. I had faced droughts, disputes, and county inspectors before. Tonight, I would face Karen. But I would do it with the careful patience that quiet heroes cultivate, the kind that lets the other person overplay their hand before any counter is made. And still the question lingered as I paused on the porch: confront her tonight, or investigate the legal documentation first. My hand hovered over the phone thumb, brushing against the smooth glass. Shadows stretched long across the deck boards, and for a moment I felt the thrill of a chess match, unseen but high stakes unfolding in the darkness. Somewhere in the quiet of Central Oregon, between the smell of wet grass and the hollow gurgle of a spigot, the battle lines were drawn. Morning sunlight spilled across the office desk, catching dust motes in golden beams. I squinted, rubbing my eyes, and then glanced out the window. The crops, which had seemed healthy just a week ago, now drooped under the relentless summer heat. Leaves curled at the edges, stems sagging, soil cracked and dusty. The spigot still ran dry. The reality of Karen's interference hit me harder in the light of day. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it threatened the entire livelihood I'd spent decades nurturing. On the counter, a stack of unopened mail mocked me. Bills, statements, and notices piled in quiet rebellion. I picked up one with a red ink stamp, past due medical bills for my aging parents. My mother's diabetes checkups, my father's physical therapy sessions. Everything came with numbers that weighed as heavily as the sun outside. Subplot of my life, a shadow running parallel to the main conflict: financial strain and responsibility for family. PTA letters from my kids' school added to the pile, reminders that my obligations extended beyond soil and fence lines. The farm needed water, my parents needed care, and the community well, the PTA fundraiser loomed this weekend. I unrolled the HOA letter again, scanning the fine print with a furrowed brow. Easement rights. Immediate compliance. Liability clauses tucked in the corners like legal tripwires. I could feel the tension coil tighter around my chest. My assistant, a temp helping during harvest season, peered over my shoulder, sensing the unease. "That's intense," she said softly. "Can they really enforce this?" Her voice carried concern, but I nodded slowly, realizing that even the professionals I relied on seemed uneasy. Out on the farm, I walked among the rows, fingers brushing over brittle leaves. Soil crumbled in my hands, dry dust falling to the ground like tiny warnings. I knelt, testing moisture several inches down. Barely damp. The irrigation pump had failed months ago. My insurance agent had promised replacement after I submitted claims, but with red ink highlighting deductible limits and replacement costs, the pressure mounted. Numbers screamed from the page, a harsh visual echo of the creeping helplessness I felt. Back inside, I opened the email thread with my agent. Figures flashed in bold red: replacement cost, labor, expedited shipping. The cursor blinked on the draft I had yet to send, a request for clarification, a push for urgency. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, tension coiling through my shoulders. The stakes weren't abstract anymore. They were tangible, pressing. Every day, without water, without action, could tip the balance between a successful harvest and disaster. And yet, the HOA's audacity meant I couldn't simply proceed without documentation. I paused, glancing at a framed photo on my desk, my parents smiling on the porch sun, catching their hair silver. PTA forms stacked beside it, inked with signatures and dues. Responsibility pressed in from every direction. My own calm, which usually carried me through late-night emergencies, now felt fragile. Could I navigate this maze of obligations and interference while preserving both livelihood and community standing? Then the microclimax: creeping helplessness. Could Karen's HOA really enforce this action? The letter's language left room for interpretation. Legal counsel would likely untangle it, but the time-sensitive nature of water for crops meant that waiting could be catastrophic. My assistant fidgeted, and even her worry was contagious. I could feel the weight of all these small crises pressing against the walls of the office, and just as my thoughts swirled, an email notification pinged sharply from the corner of the screen. I froze. Subject line: immediate compliance required. Body terse and unyielding. A 48-hour deadline. My stomach sank. The sunlight, catching the red ink of prior correspondence, now felt like a warning flare. Time, resources, legal avenues? Everything had suddenly compressed into a single, urgent window. I leaned back in the chair, staring out at the dry field. The wind stirred a faint scent of dust and sun-warmed grass, carrying with it the reminder that nature was indifferent to HOA bylaws or deadlines. My mind raced through contingencies. I could call the lawyer, draft a reply, or attempt a temporary workaround, but each choice had consequences. This was no longer a late-night inconvenience. It had become a multi-layered threat touching crops, family, and community responsibility. My mother's voice echoed in memory, asking about water supply for the morning chores. My parents' bills, the PTA's impending deadlines, and now Karen's encroaching enforcement. Each element tugged at me from a different angle, an invisible trio of pressure points demanding attention. And as I tapped my fingers against the desk, sunlight bouncing off the scattered paperwork, I realized I was on a razor's edge, a misstep, and the stakes would not merely bruise my pride, they could break it. The farm, my family, and my community obligations, the threads of responsibility, were tangled, stretched to their limits by one audacious act. I exhaled slowly, feeling both the weight and the clarity it brought. Decisions had to be made, priorities established, and strategies formulated. The HOA's notice wasn't just paper, it was a challenge. The crops drooped, the bills stared back. The PTA's forms fluttered slightly in the morning breeze. And somewhere in that convergence of pressures I felt a spark of resolve. Action had to come, measured but decisive, before the clock ran out. I sat back, letting the sunlight warm my shoulders, fingers brushing over the red ink of medical bills one last time. The creeping sense of helplessness was real, but it was also a call to focus. Tomorrow, or perhaps later today, I would draft emails, check deeds, coordinate with the insurance agent. But tonight, the farm stood still, and I had to remember the quiet hero within. The challenges were many, but my resolve was sharper. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the diner's blinds, painting stripes across the linoleum floor. The scent of burgers and coffee mixed with the faint tang of grease and vinyl seats grounding me in the familiarity of small-town rhythms. I pushed open the door, hearing the familiar jingle, and scanned for a quiet corner. Most tables were occupied by retirees nursing cups of coffee and teens on summer jobs, but one booth by the window had an empty seat opposite a man in a worn leather jacket, eyes sharp beneath silvered brows. "Mind if I sit?" I asked cautiously. He gestured toward the seat. "Be my guest. I'm Mark," he said, voice low but steady. His handshake was firm, deliberate, the kind that conveys experience without arrogance. I noticed the weathered calluses on his fingers, a subtle testament to years of hands-on work. We exchanged brief pleasantries before I explained carefully the situation with Karen and the HOA. His gaze never wavered. He listened, nodding slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as if he'd heard variations of this story before. "You might be sitting on water rights they didn't expect," he said, sliding a folded deed across the table. The county seal embossed on the paper caught the light, raising the corner in a subtle glint. My fingers hesitated over it, the weight of possibility settling in. I unfolded the document. The embossed seal felt cool under my touch, every ridge precise, official. Lines of text outlined easements and water allocations, legal language dense but promising. "How did you—" I started, but he raised a hand. "I've seen this before," Mark said. "Retired city engineer. Water law's been my side job for years. Most HOAs don't read these deeds closely. They assume compliance is automatic. They overlook the leverage buried in proper documentation." I leaned back, feeling a flicker of hope. Up until now, I'd been reacting, scrambling to maintain what little control I had over the situation. Here was someone who could see the playing field from above, someone who could point out moves I hadn't considered. Mark picked up a diner coffee cup, its ceramic rim worn steam curling lazily in the late sunlight. He took a slow sip before continuing. "You have more than a right to water. You have history on your side. Documentation precedents, even minor irregularities in notices, they can be turned to your advantage if handled carefully." I glanced down at the table. A half-eaten cheeseburger sat near my elbow, its warmth radiating faintly, reminding me of mundane comforts amidst mounting stress. The ordinary meal contrasted sharply with the extraordinary implications of the conversation. My confidence, tentative before, began to solidify. Small-town HOAs rely on intimidation more than law. Mark continued. They hope people won't check the fine print. That's where you start. Check everything. Emails, letters, photographs, even a smudge on a notice, the timestamp on an email, it all matters. He tapped the checklist he slid across the table, a compact handwritten guide for evidence collection, water readings, meter logs, notices, photographs of property boundaries. Every item precise, actionable. We exchanged anecdotes about past HOA disputes he'd mediated or observed. His voice carried stories of homeowners standing firm, of bureaucratic overreach, of clever documentation turning the tide. Between bites of my lukewarm burger and sips of coffee, I realized I was absorbing not just technical guidance but strategy mindset. He had a knack for making complex water laws and property easements feel manageable. "You're not powerless," Mark said. "You can act, and you should. The key is confidence and preparation. Keep everything organized. Even the smallest detail counts." He leaned back, letting the words sink in. A faint smile played across his lips. "And remember, you don't have to play their game on their terms." I exhaled, slowly tracing the embossed seal on the deed again. The relief wasn't complete. Karen's interference still loomed, but now it felt like a challenge I could meet rather than a trap I was ensnared in. My hands, previously tense on the tabletop, relaxed slightly. For the first time since discovering the cutoff, I felt the stirrings of control, of agency. The waitress approached to refill coffee, glancing at the deed. Mark nodded politely, introducing himself as she set down the cup. Even in this small, ordinary setting, the legal weight of the paper felt momentarily surreal. Sunlight shifted, casting long shadows across the table. The aroma of coffee, the faint sizzle from the kitchen, and the warmth of the diner contrasted sharply with the tension I'd carried through the past days. Mark leaned forward, lowering his voice. Document everything. Even the small details count in court. Photos, receipts, timestamps, any irregularity, and notices, they're all ammunition. If you move smart, you can turn her bluff into leverage. I nodded, already envisioning the steps, photographing the spigot, noting the waterline, cross-referencing notices with my own records. The checklist lay open, tangible strategy in hand. I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt since the spigot ran dry: confidence, a sense of being capable of pushing back without reckless action. Knack 5. Self-assured, proactive, ready to respond. Before leaving the diner, Mark tapped the deed lightly. Remember, Karen thrives on assumption. She doesn't expect you to know your rights. Use that. And keep your temper. Clarity beats confrontation. His advice hung in the air, solid and precise. I folded the deed carefully, sliding it into my jacket. As I stepped back into the fading sunlight, the warmth of the day softened the edges of tension. The farm, the dry crops, the looming HOA compliance, they were still challenges, but now I had direction. I wasn't merely reacting. I had a plan guided by experience and legal insight. For the first time, the threat seemed negotiable rather than overwhelming. And yet, the microcliff lingered in my mind. Documentation was only the start. The next steps mattered. Each choice could sway the balance between compliance and leverage. Walking back to the truck, I felt the stirrings of determination tempered with patience. The quiet hero within me was no longer idle. It had guidance, strategy, and the faint thrill of anticipation. The late summer sun hung low over the farmyard, casting long shadows across the parched earth. I approached the spigot, flashlight in hand, though the sunlight was enough to catch the details. That's when I noticed it, a hairline crack running along the metal's curve, thin as a strand of wire, yet ominous in its permanence. Water had barely trickled through the tap that morning, and now this prop number 2 rift made tangible. The HOA notice fluttered nearby, pinned weakly against the fence by a wind-twisted nail. Each gust made the paper tremble, the official seal staring back like an accusation. I picked it up, careful not to smudge the ink, and read aloud the section on special assessments. My assistant, a young man eager to prove his competence, snapped photos of the crack, holding the camera just so that the sunlight highlighted the imperfection. Every shadow emphasized the fissure. Every click of the shutter echoed like a warning in the quiet farmyard. "Looks bad," he said, adjusting the angle. "This will show up clearly in documentation." "Yes," I replied, forcing calm into my voice. Inside, doubts stirred. The spigot wasn't just damaged. It symbolized a fracture in control, a reminder that Karen's interference had tangible consequences. The special assessment clause promised financial strain, but beyond that, I felt the creeping weight of community scrutiny. Neighbors whispered about Karen's strictness about the farm that didn't toe the line. That gossip gnawed subtly like insects beneath the bark. I set the photos aside and reread the notice, each line underlining potential fees, deadlines, and the implicit threat of escalation. The language was precise, bureaucratic, and cold. Every word was a reminder: inaction or misstep could be costly. My assistant stood by, clipboard in hand, noting each detail. The ritual of documentation offered some comfort, a tangible method to counter abstract intimidation. By mid-afternoon, I had drafted an email to my law firm. Fingers hovering over the keyboard, I chose every word with care: factual, unemotional, precise. No accusation, no hyperbole, just the facts. Water disruption, spigot damage. HOA, notice photographs attached. Each sentence was a small act of defiance, a measured strike in a growing chess match. Sending it would mark the first formal step toward action. Outside, the breeze tugged at the edges of the notice again. The paper flapped against the fence, a percussive reminder that time was slipping. Even in the quiet of the farm, I could feel the pressure building. The microclimax was unmistakable. The stakes weren't just theoretical. They were legal, financial, social. Every potential fee, every neighbor whisper, every crack in the spigot compounded into a palpable weight pressing on my shoulders. I knelt by the spigot, turning it slightly in my hands. The hairline fracture caught the sunlight, its imperfection undeniable. This was no longer an abstract nuisance. It was a tangible threat to the farm's operations. I made notes in the margin of my field notebook, careful to record date, time, light conditions, and all observations. Even the minor imperfections in the metal became part of a growing dossier, a defense against potential overreach. My parents' irrigation schedule will be disrupted if this worsens, I muttered, thinking aloud more to process than to inform. The assistant nodded silently, recording every word. He had been skeptical at first, but witnessing the crack and reading the official HOA language seemed to awaken the gravity of the situation. Then, through the slight murmur of wind, a neighbor's voice carried from across the field. "Karen's making rounds again," they said, tone, just loud enough for me to catch. My chest tightened. Karen wouldn't confront me directly, but her presence, her network of observation, had always been an invisible pressure. Every whispered report was another thread in the web of tension surrounding the farm. I returned to the laptop, drafting additional notes for the law firm. References to easements, prior correspondence, and photographic evidence filled the page. Each paragraph reinforced the narrative. I would present the HOA's interference had immediate and measurable consequences. I attached the spigot photos, careful to highlight the fracture without embellishment. Accuracy was crucial. Exaggeration would undermine credibility. The sunlight began to soften, shifting the farmyard into warmer hues. Dust motes danced in the glow, drifting lazily across the cracked concrete of the pump pad. The juxtaposition of serene beauty and escalating tension was jarring. This small, ordinary landscape had become the theater for a legal and social struggle the subtle cracks now mirrored in both metal and community relations. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. The reality was, clear escalation was inevitable. I could hope for Karen to relent or act strategically with the legal footing Mark had previously highlighted. The clock ticked audibly in my mind. Every delay magnified the pressure. Decision-making now was a test of composure, foresight, and patience. As I collected my notes and photographs, I noticed the HOA notice fluttering one last time before settling against the fence, sunlight catching the embossed seal. The imperfection in the spigot, the bureaucratic threat of the assessment, and the murmurs from the neighborhood coalesced into a singular awareness I could no longer treat Karen's interference lightly. The cracks were both literal and metaphorical. A deep breath, deliberate steadying myself against the rising tide of doubt and anxiety. My hand hovered over the phone call the HOA schedule a hearing or rely on documented correspondence for now. The decision loomed heavy and unavoidable. Outside, the hum of irrigation machinery reminded me of ongoing responsibilities, life moving forward despite legal tangles and fractured spigots. Even as the day drew toward evening, tension held firm. Every action taken or delayed would resonate through financial obligations, crop health, and community perception. I gathered the last item's photographs, carefully saved email draft poised for review. The prop number 2 rift was no longer abstract. It demanded attention, care, and strategy. And yet, within the weight of escalation, a tiny ember of resolve glimmered. The farm had endured droughts, windstorms, and bureaucratic overreach before. This crack, this notice, this social pressure, it was simply the next test. How I chose to respond would define the coming weeks, the positioning for the imminent HOA confrontation, and perhaps the eventual resolution that could tip the scales toward fairness. I stared at the notice one last time, wind tugging gently, a fluttering reminder of the consequences in motion. The micro-cliff remained: schedule a hearing or confront Karen directly. Time was the silent adversary. I stepped back, letting the spigot's fractured form settle into shadow, knowing that the next move was both inevitable and critical. The county hearing room hummed with low murmurs, a blend of whispered speculation and the scratch of pens on paper. I slid the embossed deed across the polished oak table, feeling its weight not just in hand, but in consequence. Karen's eyes flicked over it, lips curling in a smug half-smile that suggested she thought she had anticipated every move. She hadn't. Stacks of documents flanked me: photographs of the cracked spigot waterline assessments, insurance statements, previous correspondence with the HOA, and easement maps. Each sheet was meticulously organized, a visual argument demanding attention. My fingers tapped lightly against the edges, a silent rhythm of determination. "Let's begin the hearing." Officer intoned her voice, measured, neutral, but carrying the authority that made the room contract in subtle tension. I felt the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the faint scent of coffee wafting from a corner mingling with the sterile aroma of paper and varnish. Every detail was part of the environment, quietly intense. Karen leaned back, crossing her arms. "I assure you, compliance with HOA regulations is not negotiable," she said, voice firm, eyes glinting with entitlement. There was an undercurrent of amusement in her tone, as though she considered my presence a minor inconvenience rather than a challenge. I cleared my throat, picking up the deed again. With all due respect, the property easements clearly indicate rights that extend to my irrigation setup, I said, emphasizing the embossed county seal. The spigot and pipe systems were installed according to these legal parameters. I allowed a pause, letting the words settle in the charged room. Whispers rustled from the few neighbors present, their eyes darting between us. The mentor sat slightly behind me, hands folded, eyes calm yet watchful. He gave a subtle nod, almost imperceptible, signaling I should highlight the easement details further. I adjusted, pointing to the specific clauses, the water line's installation, prior approvals, and corresponding dates. Karen interjected sharply. "You're misconstruing the bylaws. Immediate compliance is required under Section 4.3, and these documents do not exempt you from special assessment obligations." Her voice carried both irritation and a hint of panic, an unintentional giveaway that my preparation was effective. I maintained a steady tone. Section 4.3 outlines general compliance but does not nullify documented easements or prior approvals. These photographs, I said, holding up close-ups of the cracked spigot and pipe, demonstrate maintenance and evidence of undue restriction by HOA action. The sunlight from a small window fell across the glossy photos, highlighting the hairline fracture. Shadows emphasized the imperfection, as if the crack itself were testifying. A murmur went through the room. The hearing officer leaned forward, scrutinizing the documents. I could feel the tension coil tighter, the microclimax approaching. Karen's eyes darted between the deed, the photographs, and my calm, steady hands. Her earlier confidence wavered ever so slightly. A twitch of her jaw betrayed concern. I exhaled slowly, allowing the quiet to punctuate my point. "This is not about defiance," I continued. "It's about ensuring that legal rights properly documented and recognized by county ordinance are respected. Immediate restrictions without due process compromise not just me, but community trust." My voice carried enough authority to fill the room without raising volume, measured but firm. Karen's hand hovered over a folder of her own, the one she had clearly intended to use to interrupt or dismiss me. Instead, she paused, flicking through pages more cautiously than before. Her composure had been rattled. I could sense it in the subtle tension of her shoulders, the slight narrowing of her eyes. The assistant I had brought along leaned over slightly, handing me a small stack of insurance statements. Red ink margins marked dates and amounts of potential financial exposure. I nodded silently, acknowledging that these were further reinforcement of stakes beyond the spigot itself. Not just water rights, not just cracked pipes, but real, tangible obligations that Karen's overreach could exacerbate. The mentor's presence was reassuring without overt interference. I caught his eye once, a slight raise of an eyebrow reminding me to maintain clarity and not let emotion guide the delivery. I felt a surge of confidence, the transition from previous helplessness to proactive control. NAC 7 Tweetvang Apluk had begun to transform into deliberate, calculated resolve. Karen's interruptions became more measured, less certain. "This evidence. You're suggesting the easement has priority." Her voice lost some of the earlier hauteur, revealing cracks in her certainty. "Yes," I replied firmly, tapping the deed again. "Legal precedents and documented easements take priority over unilateral enforcement actions." I let my words sink in. The room seemed to contract slightly, a collective acknowledgement of the shift in momentum. Even the neighbors' hushed exchanges suggested the narrative had tilted. The microclimax reached its peak as the hearing officer scanned each page, then leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. Silence hung, punctuated only by the subtle ticking of the wall clock and the faint scratch of a pen adjusting papers. My heart pounded in a rhythm both nervous and anticipatory. This was the crescendo of preparation strategy and quiet heroism, prop number 1 in memory, prop number 2 fracture in evidence, legal leverage in hand. Karen's eyes narrowed. For the first time I caught the edge of fear beneath her practiced composure. A subtle flinch, a hesitation in her rebuttal indicated that the strategy was working. My confidence rose in tandem, yet I remained cautious. I knew better than to underestimate her resilience. Finally, the hearing officer spoke, her tone deliberate. "Further investigation is required. No immediate determination will be made today." The words fell like measured gavel strikes, leaving the room suspended between resolution and uncertainty. I glanced at Karen. Her face was unreadable, yet the tension beneath was unmistakable. My own unease mixed with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The first phase of confrontation had succeeded. Stakes had peaked, evidence had been revealed, and the dynamic had shifted. I packed my documents carefully, stacking each photograph, deed, and insurance statement with precision. The mentor gave a discreet nod of approval as I gathered the papers. Outside, the late spring sunlight warmed the hallway beyond the hearing room, contrasting with the cool fluorescent interior. Every step toward the door was deliberate, each breath measured, aware that the next confrontation would demand the same strategic calm. The whispers of neighbors followed a low murmur of speculation and curiosity. Karen gathered her folder slowly, her smug smile subdued into a tense line. I knew the next move, further hearings, documentation, possible town hall presentation, would define the unfolding weeks. Yet for now, the room's energy had shifted. I was no longer a passive target. Quiet hero resolve, combined with evidence and preparation, had carved space for agency. My hand rested briefly over the embossed deed one last time before slipping it into the portfolio. The spigot in memory. The fractured pipe in photographs and the stack of HOA letters formed a tableau of persistence and strategy. Clarity had emerged from tension, and though uncertainty remained, I had made a deliberate, calculated stand. And yet, the cliffhanger lingered. The hearing officer's decision of further investigation required left questions unresolved. Karen's reaction, restrained but wary, suggested she understood the shift but would regroup. I stepped into the hallway, mindful of the subtle weight of community observation, the evidence now firmly in hand, and the quiet determination that had carried me this far. The battle was far from over, but the first crescendo had been reached. The courtroom lights gleamed off polished wood, casting long, sharp shadows across the benches where neighbors had gathered. The air was filled with quiet anticipation, punctuated by distant hums of lawnmowers outside and the soft shuffle of papers from the public gallery. I set the final stack of documents before the hearing officer, hands steady, despite the adrenaline humming beneath my skin. Each piece, emails, easement maps, notarized HOA letters, was carefully layered, culminating in the ultimate proof, the signed water deed embossed with the county seal. Karen sat across from me, her posture rigid. The smile she once wore with such confidence had faded into a taut line, eyes narrowing as she scanned the documents. I caught the subtle tremor in her hands when she lifted one of the easement maps. The cracks in her composure mirrored the spigot I had photographed months earlier. I cleared my throat softly. As outlined in the water deed, these easement rights are legally binding. I began, voice calm but deliberate. I held the paper slightly higher, feeling the embossed seal press into my palm, a tactile reassurance that this fight was grounded not in opinion, but in law. Each clause I read aloud, highlighted dates, prior approvals, and explicit permissions that had been overlooked or ignored in previous HOA correspondence. The mentor leaned slightly toward me, whispering, "Observe her reactions. Every flinch, every hesitation documented." I nodded, subtly acknowledging the guidance while keeping my attention on the room. Neighbors shifted in their seats, eyes flicking between Karen, the documents, and me. Some nodded ever so slightly, a few exchanged glances absorbing the weight of the evidence. Karen cleared her throat, attempting to interject. "These clauses, they—" Her voice faltered, the authority she tried to project undermined by the undeniable documentation. I maintained eye contact, letting the papers speak louder than any rebuttal could. Every inked signature, every embossed seal reinforced the legitimacy of my claims. I paused, letting the quiet fill the courtroom. The subtle scent of polished wood, mingled with the faint aroma of coffee lingering from the early morning proceedings, grounded me. The room seemed to lean forward, collectively absorbing each word, each paper shuffle. I could feel the momentum shift. NAC 9 catharsis, anticipation of justice, was palpable. With measured precision, I continued reading the easement clauses that directly addressed water rights and property access. My hands, though slightly trembling from the cumulative tension, were steady enough to turn each page deliberately. The embossed county seal caught the light, glinting like a silent witness to months of careful preparation. Karen's eyes darted from the deed to the maps, lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. Each micro-movement reinforced the stakes. Her authority, her assumed control, was unraveling under the weight of documented fact. The hearing officer interjected softly, reviewing each document. The notarized deed and accompanying evidence confirmed the petitioner's legal water rights. HOA compliance measures cannot override documented easements. Her words landed with measured finality, echoing slightly against the polished wood. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. Karen's shoulders slumped imperceptibly. The veneer of dominance she carried so confidently just days ago was now visibly cracked. I allowed myself a brief glance toward the mentor. His expression remained composed, though a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He whispered again. Public witnesses noticed their reactions. They reinforce the weight of your claims. I scanned the gallery neighbors, nodding subtle gestures of support, minor murmurs of approval. This was the quiet recognition of community acknowledgement, a legal and social catharsis intertwined. Karen fumbled with her papers, attempting to maintain some semblance of authority. Her voice, when it emerged, lacked conviction. I see. Perhaps there is precedent I did not anticipate. The hesitation was telling. She was forced to confront the reality I had documented meticulously. The spigot, the cracked pipe, the letters, all elements of the narrative now converged. Her overreach laid bare before the county and the community she sought to control. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension release incrementally. Chapter 10. Kao Trao Kung Li was achieved not with volume or confrontation, but through careful presentation, patience, and adherence to documented truth. The courtroom absorbed this resolution. Even the air seemed to shift subtly lighter, yet charged with acknowledgement. The hearing officer made notes, her pen scratching quietly against the pages. The HOA must comply with documented easements, and any enforcement contrary to these rights is invalid. The statement was precise, devoid of flourish, yet carried a quiet weight that resonated beyond the walls of the room. Karen's attempt at argument dissolved in the presence of fact and community witness. I gathered the final pages into my portfolio, embossed seal resting on top. The mentor gave a subtle nod, a gesture of shared satisfaction. Outside, sunlight gleamed off the courthouse steps, promising summer warmth. Inside, the room buzzed softly with subdued excitement, a tangible acknowledgement that justice, though procedural, had been served. Karen retreated silently, her departure unnoticed by few. Eyes lingered on her as she walked out, the murmurs of neighbors blending into a low hum. The sense of triumph was tempered with reflection. The work of documentation, the months of observation, the careful noting of micro-details had coalesced into this decisive moment. The public had witnessed order restored, rights affirmed, and accountability maintained. I placed the deed carefully back into the portfolio, pausing to appreciate the embossed seal under the courtroom light. The prop number 2 fracture, the spigot damage documented earlier, had catalyzed the narrative now resolved in full. Mentor guidance had ensured measured presentation, and the subtle acknowledgement from neighbors reinforced the communal dimension of victory. As the gallery began to disperse, a few whispered words of congratulations reached me. The fight was over in formal terms, yet the subtle, quiet victory lingered, proof that meticulous preparation, strategic patience, and adherence to principles could overcome presumptive authority. The NAC 9-10 journey had delivered catharsis, not just personal triumph, but public acknowledgement and justice enacted through evidence and patience. Karen's absence left a silence filled by nods, murmurs, and the quiet shuffle of papers. The courtroom, once tense and charged, now carried a measured calm. I could feel a lingering warmth, the subtle recognition that the community had witnessed not merely the legal outcome, but the affirmation of fairness, order, and respect for documented rights. The final documents were more than paper, they were testimony, procedure, and quiet ceremony all at once. The cliffhanger remained gentle. Karen had retreated, yet the question persisted. How would the community benefit most from the resolution? This was not a battle over vengeance, but over legacy rights and the careful stewardship of shared resources. The path forward promised opportunity, reflection, and the kind of measured, deliberate action that could turn procedural victory into communal good. The late afternoon sun warmed the courthouse steps as I stepped outside, squinting against the glare. The air carried a gentle breeze, rustling papers in neighbors' hands and tossing a few stray leaves along the sidewalk. Dog barks echoed from nearby yards, a familiar backdrop that reminded me life outside, legal battles still pulsed steadily. The tension that had filled the room hours ago had dissipated, replaced by a calm satisfaction that was almost tangible. My phone buzzed. An email from the HOA caught my eye. Fines rescinded, compliance notices withdrawn. They acknowledged the precedents established by the notarized water deed. A subtle smile tugged at my lips. Karen's rigid stance had softened in writing, though her tone retained its usual formality. Still, the bite of her previous actions had dulled. Order, at least temporarily, had returned. I glanced at the mentor standing quietly nearby. He offered a small nod, eyes crinkling in a gesture of restrained pride. No words were necessary. He had guided the process, and the resolution reflected the careful planning, the patient documentation, and the insistence on measured presentation. Supportive neighbors lingered, exchanging brief smiles and murmurs of approval. Their recognition wasn't loud or ostentatious, but it carried weight. This was the subtle acknowledgement of justice enacted and authority balanced. Later that afternoon, I returned to the farm. The spigot, the original prop number 1 previously cracked and riven, had been repaired. Water flowed clear and steady, a quiet triumph mirrored in the gentle gurgle that had once signaled threat. I ran my fingers along the cool metal, tracing the smooth surface where the fracture had once been. It was more than a functional repair. It was a symbolic gesture of restored balance, the tangible conclusion to months of tension, legal maneuvering, and community scrutiny. Prop number 3 healed, and running served as a silent testament to the journey from vulnerability to empowered resolution. Emails and letters continued to arrive throughout the day. Notices confirmed rescinded fines, reaffirmed easement rights, and offered clarifications to prevent future misunderstandings. One message flagged by the local newspaper hinted at broader policy adjustments within the HOA, subtle shifts that suggested my case had prompted reflection, perhaps even reform. The idea was almost amusing, a single dispute nudging slow-moving bureaucracy toward change. The mentor remained nearby as I walked the property, observing the spigot and the surrounding irrigation lines. He gestured lightly toward the repaired pipe. "Sometimes the smallest victories carry the largest lessons," he murmured. I nodded, appreciating both the words and the shared quiet pride. The practical resolution of water flow mirrored the larger achievement of legal and social acknowledgement. The HOA's authority had been checked, the documentation honored, and the community quietly reinforced in their awareness of rights and responsibilities. Neighbors trickled onto the property, offering nods and brief congratulations. The assistant helped me review remaining emails, confirming that all fines had been officially withdrawn and that notices were filed correctly for future reference. The rhythm of small tasks, checking water pressure, noting the repaired spigot, confirming email responses, felt grounding after months of tension. Each act reinforced the sense that order had been restored and that personal and community stakes had been resolved. I paused at the spigot, watching water run over my hand. The sun reflected off the droplets, sparkling as if acknowledging the journey from conflict to resolution. I thought back to the cracked pipe. The fluttering HOA noticed the courtroom tension and the whispers of neighbors observing. The narrative of struggle evidence and legal diligence had reached a quiet denouement. The prop number 2 fracture had been healed, and the final prop number 3 flowing water stood as testament to resilience, careful preparation, and the subtle triumph of patience over presumption. The day wound on with light fading into a warm glow over the farm. Emails from the HOA concluded with formal acknowledgments. The local paper's online post referenced my case, highlighting the importance of community oversight and legal diligence. Mentor gave a last nod, ready to depart, leaving me with the quiet satisfaction of a job well executed. Financial relief, personal vindication, and the support of neighbors had merged into a singular, satisfying sense of equilibrium. Yet, even as the immediate tension dissolved, curiosity lingered. The community asked quietly among themselves what comes next for water management, for HOA oversight, for the continued balance between individual rights and collective governance. These questions remained open-ended invitations for reflection and careful stewardship, signaling that while a chapter closed, the narrative of communal responsibility continued. I lingered at the repaired spigot, hand resting against the cool metal, listening to the steady flow. The breeze shifted, carrying with it the soft scent of late summer grass and the faint aroma of wood smoke from distant chimneys. Each detail, each sensation anchored the victory in the tangible world. The personal stakes had been resolved, the prop number 3 symbolically restored, and the NAC 11 journey Giai Toa Kanbang Quin look had reached its natural conclusion. As twilight approached, I took one final look around the farm, neighbors quietly dispersing emails, acknowledged water flowing, tension dissolved. The mentor departed with a quiet wave, leaving me to contemplate the delicate balance of authority, patience, and preparation that had carried us here. The journey from cracked spigot to restored flow had mirrored the legal and social restoration that now lay firmly in place, leaving a calm, satisfied sense of accomplishment in its wake. The cliffhanger lingered gently. The farm, the community, and the HOA now faced future choices. How would water management evolve? How would oversight be refined? The answers would unfold slowly, but the foundation of fairness, precedent, and measured action had been laid. And for the moment, the quiet heroism of patience and diligence had won. The summer sun reflected off the reservoir, turning it golden. Neighbors gathered around picnic tables, banners celebrating restored water access fluttering in the breeze. Children laughed and skipped along the banks, tossing pebbles into the water, their voices carrying across the farm. Adults exchanged nods, shared quiet smiles, and greeted local officials observing the peaceful scene. The air smelled of barbecue lemonade and freshly cut grass. It was a moment of calm after years of tension. I walked to the repaired spigot, prop number 3, watching water flow steadily, a symbol of restored balance. What had once been a source of conflict now ran freely, a tangible reminder of resilience and collective effort. Mentor stood nearby, quiet and observant. His guidance throughout had been invaluable, yet today the focus belonged to the community. The dedication ceremony centered on a polished plaque mounted on a stone pedestal. It honored the neighbors' combined effort to protect water rights, highlighting careful documentation, legal diligence, and cooperation. I helped unveil it. Neighbors applauded quietly, pride evident in their expressions. Each word engraved reflected months of planning, evidence collection, and persistent action. I spoke briefly with younger neighbors about legal vigilance, emphasizing the importance of record-keeping, noticing small details and respecting rules while standing up for rights. Some listened intently. Others smiled at my earnestness. The exchange felt like passing knowledge forward, ensuring the community remained prepared. Nearby neighbors discussed a shared water fund to maintain the reservoir and irrigation systems. Laughter and chatter punctuated the planning, transforming previous tension into productive collaboration. Every conversation reflected a commitment to protect both the resource and the relationships strengthened by past challenges. HOA. Karen was absent. Her formal email earlier that day acknowledged the settlement and legally confirmed water rights. There was no confrontation, only subtle satisfaction, authority restored without drama. Her absence underscored the community's success achieved through meticulous preparation and evidence. I traced the irrigation channels, appreciating how each valve and repaired pipe symbolized progress from conflict to resolution. Prop number 3, once a point of contention, now embodied collective victory. Mentor's hand on my shoulder conveyed quiet approval. "You've done more than secure water," he said softly. "You've strengthened trust and set an example." His modest words carried weight, affirming the importance of measured action. The ceremony wound down, yet neighbors lingered, enjoying the picnic, gentle water sounds, and warm sunlight. Subtle details stood out: scent of lemonade, soft clinking of dishes, scraping chairs on grass. Ordinary moments now felt meaningful reflections of hard-won harmony. The reservoir mirrored restored balance, calm and steady. I paused at the water's edge, watching children skip stones. The flowing spigot reminded me that justice and cooperation could coexist. Mentor's nod reinforced the satisfaction of resolution, the farm, thriving, neighbors engaged, legal rights affirmed. Lessons of patience, careful documentation, and collaboration were tangible in every smiling face. By twilight, the farm quieted. Water flowed uninterrupted. The scent of grass and smoke lingered. Young neighbors lingered briefly. Mentor waved farewell. I took one last look at the reservoir. Prop number 3 flowed freely. The plaque caught the sun's last rays. Healing and hope, NAC 12, had been fully realized. Quiet pride, shared relief, and community cohesion prevailed. The reservoir glistened as evening approached. Neighbors exchanged hugs, handshakes, and smiles. The shared water fund and revised bylaws promised continued cooperation. Mentor's quiet presence reminded me of the guidance that led here, but the celebration belonged to all. I felt subtle pride in our collective accomplishment, knowing conflict had been transformed into collaboration. Walking the reservoir edges one last time, I reflected on the journey. Prop number 3 symbolized healed bonds and legal clarity. HOA, Karen's absence, her email confirming settlement, marked the end of confrontation. The community's shared effort secured not only water rights but mutual trust and responsibility. As darkness settled, the farm embraced calm. Water continued flowing from the spigot, children's laughter faded, replaced by quiet conversation. Every detail, the smell of barbecued food, rustling leaves, polished plaques, signified lessons learned, vigilance, patience, and the value of community. Mentor's nod, neighborly smiles, and flowing water were proof that balance had been restored. By the time the sun fully set, the picnic tables were empty, banners still fluttering. Water ran freely from prop number 3, the farm thriving. Healing and hope prevailed. Community trust, legal clarity, and collective effort had triumphed. I stood at the water's edge, feeling peace. Closure was complete, the farm secure, and the future bright. The gate clicks quietly behind us, and the newly named Henderson Reservoir mirrors the late afternoon sun like a gentle sigh. I hang the mended spigot in the barn, water flowing cleanly once more, a quiet testament to patience and persistence. Justice isn't loud. It arrives through steady effort, shared responsibility, and attention to detail. Neighbors laugh, children cast lines into the water, and conversation buzzes over lemonade and pies. We reclaimed more than water, we reclaimed trust and community. If your street faces overreach, share your story. How did patience and cooperation make a difference?